Hey everyone, welcome back to Reading with Tatiana. Today I'm reviewing my first Stephen King book as an adult, and it was Pet Sematary, as it was highly recommended on Booktube, especially the weeks leading up to Halloween, and I gave this book a 5 out of 5 read. Before I go into my full book review, my Booktuber Shoutout is to Jack and the Bookstack. I'm recommending her channel because it was the video that convinced me to read Pet Sematary as my first Stephen King book as an adult. If you want to check out her channel, I'll link it down below, as she showcases and highlights a lot of horror genre books. And as always, if you're watching this video, I will always appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you've ever read this book or have any recommendations on any other Stephen King books I should read, please comment down below. The genre of his book is no surprise, as it's from the king of horror himself, is horror. This book was published in 1983, so it's one of his earlier works, and it's pretty interesting because this is like a newer edition. So there's actually a forward say that when he first wrote this book, he wasn't sure if he was going to have it published because he felt it was too dark, but he shared it with his wife Tabitha, and she's like, publish it. So it's kind of cool with that tidbit, because this book could have easily just been kept not for the public to read. A bit about the author Stephen King. I feel there's so much I could say about him, so these are just the highlights that stuck out with me, as this is a book review and not an author profile. So he, as I said before, is the king of horror. He was born and raised in the state of Maine in America. He was a weekly column writer for his university paper when he went to university. During that time, he had a very strong stance and was very active against the war in Vietnam, which I think is pretty cool to learn about him. And also he met his wife Tabitha during university. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts, and he also was able to teach high school. So when he graduated university, he started teaching, I don't think right away, but like shortly after, and he would write short stories and also write his novels on the weekends and evenings. But it wasn't until 1974 when he published his first book, Carrie. One thing that I thought was interesting about Stephen King while I was reading some facts about him was that he admits and isn't, shy, that he used to have a substance problem, and it was so severe that when he wrote Cujo, one of his very famous books, he actually forgot about even writing it. Fortunately, his friends and family had intervention for him in the late 80s, and it appears that he's been sober since, which I think is very admirable. And since starting writing back in his youth, he is very prolific in not just the horror genre, but also I think in the writing world. He is now, I think, in his mid-70s, and he has 65 published novels. He's also written under the pen name Richard Bachman. He's also written over 200 short stories that have now been put into 11 collections. I also mentioned Cujo earlier, which is a famous book of his that's become a movie adaptation. And also the other one is The Shining, which I think a lot of people know is also a movie adaptation. And I also learned today that The Green Mile is also one of his books that I'm pretty sure is also a movie adaptation. So I think if you're someone that's a fan of reading books that have become movies, Stephen King is probably the right author to check out. A bit about the premise and how the story starts. Obviously, as this is a horror, I won't go into too much detail because I feel like it's worth reading for yourself. So the story starts, I believe it's set in the state of Maine, where Stephen King is born and raised. And I think I read that a lot of his books are set in his home state, which I think is pretty cool, but also terrifying, because I don't know, I felt terrified while reading this book. I'm like, oh, he wrote it and he was inspired from that area. Anyway, so the book starts with Dr. Lewis Creed. He is a doctor, and he got a job in Ludlow, which I believe is also in Maine. And so he's going to uproot his family of his wife and 2 young kids to Ludlow to live. When they move in, they find that their house is along this really busy highway where there's lots of trucks driving back and forth. And their neighbor across the street, his name is Judd, and he comes over. He's a very friendly elderly man who has a wife called Norma. He introduces himself. He kind of gives a foreshadow warning saying, be careful of this highway because lots of pets get killed on this road. And then he kind of takes them to this trail that kind of leads from their backyard to this local pet cemetery, which is the name of the title. And if you're wondering why cemetery is spelled incorrectly, it's because the cemetery in the book is kind of a place where the local kids bury their pets, and obviously a kid made the sign for the cemetery, so it's spelled incorrectly. So Judd kind of shows the family this pet cemetery, and then that's kind of how the book starts. And then I think on Lewis's first day of work at the local hospital at the university where he's stationed, a student dies. Basically, a student is taken to the hospital and he is just injured beyond saving or salvaging. And then that night, Lewis, as he's sleeping, gets visited by the student who passed away at his work earlier in the day. And the student kind of gives him a warning, and the student kind of takes him to the pet cemetery as well in this dream, and it's just kind of like a really creepy dream. When I read this part of the book, I actually stopped because it was getting late, and that night I woke up because I had to go to the bathroom, and I was too scared to go to the bathroom because in the book, Lewis woke up and then the student was at the doorway. So I had that same feeling. So this book was really great at giving me the creepy crawlies. So anyways, Lewis assumes it's a dream, but the next day he wakes up and when he looks down his bed sheets, he finds that his legs are tracked with mud and dirt and sticks. So it seems like that maybe it wasn't a dream and it actually was something that happened to him and he was visited by a spirit. I'll stop there with the premise of the story. I'm just going to set it up for you. But basically, after this, I guess, meeting with this deceased student, things just start getting kind of hairy in this new town they move into. I think I kind of already set some foreshadowing to the story. So yeah, that's the premise of the story. I'm not going to go too much into characters, but basically there is a main cast of Lewis, his wife Rachel, their two young kids, Ellie and Gage, which are pretty important to the story, and also their pet cat. And the reason why I mentioned their pet cat is important is because the book is called Pet Sematary, and earlier I mentioned how lots of local pets get hit on the highway by truckers. There's also the neighbors across the street, which I mentioned earlier, Judd and Norma, his wife. And yeah, I feel like the Pet Cemetery in itself is also a character in the book. Common themes I found in this book was the idea of guilt and not doing enough to save someone, to help someone, and stuff that happens in your childhood that you carry into your adulthood and debilitates you. Another common one, kind of like I just mentioned, is trauma from your childhood, which affects and bleeds into your adulthood. So a backstory for this is Lewis's wife Rachel had a sister when she was growing up called Zelda, and she died from a illness. And because of that, Rachel is kind of scarred with the idea of death and can't really talk about death and even avoid funerals of people close to her. So that's a common theme I think of how like not dealing with your trauma when you're young can bleed into your adulthood. A other common one, without giving spoilers, but I would just foreshadow, is the idea of leaving the dead and also respecting indigenous land. Stephen King didn't explicitly talk about not respecting indigenous land, but I think if you read the book, it's very clear that's what it alludes to, or at least for me reading it from 2022. I don't know if that's his intention when he read it, just because this book was written 40 years ago. I'm not sure how much the indigenous, scope was prevalent back then, but for me, someone reading the book in 2022, I found that to be a very common theme in the book. Things I didn't like about this book, to be honest, there wasn't much I didn't like. I really enjoyed it. I usually don't, not saying I have not read horror up until this point in my life, really, except for a Stephen King book when I was in grade 4, Dreamcatcher, and I was way too young. But even though this is a horror book, it wasn't anything that was really jarring for me. I mean, yes, it was jarring, but it never felt like, oh my god, he went too far. It kept me hooked, and I really enjoyed it. The only complaint I had was that, as I mentioned earlier, the scene where the deceased student visits him at night, that was scary enough to make me not be scared to go to the bathroom at night. And I will admit that every night I read this book, usually my partner will watch TV in the living room, but for every night I read this book, I made him roll the TV into the bedroom so he will be beside me when I'm reading it and also when I fall asleep. I gave this book a 5 out of 5, so there are tons of things I really enjoyed about this book. Things that really surprised me was that sometimes when I read books, I feel like authors or writers can over-describe a situation, and I'm just okay, this is dragging. Why are they doing this? But Stephen King, I don't know what his talent is. Obviously, he's very talented. He's very prolific. I just love his style, his descriptive writing, his way of setting the mood and the ambiance, and also just putting the internal dialogue of every character onto pages. I never felt like it dragged. I never felt like it was too much. It just felt like it was enough, and I'm here to read it. I also really enjoy how The characters were all essential to the story, and also they felt very fleshed out. And they all had to go through their journey to go through their character development, and I thought it was done really well. And I think even if I don't like horror as a genre normally, Stephen King's writing makes it so that I like reading it, if that makes sense. On Goodreads, this book has been out for decades, so I'd say the rating is very accurate, and it has an average of 4.04 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. I'll start with reasons why people didn't like this book. So I think reasons why people didn't like this book is they went in with high expectations of this book being the scariest book that Stephen King has ever written. And when they read it, they weren't scared, so disappointed, which I think makes sense for bad reviews, especially if they read his other books as well. People also thought the action was too delayed and was too focused on the last 60 to 80 pages. For me, maybe because of my first horror, so I felt like there was action throughout the whole book. I was like intrigued the whole time. People also thought they didn't like it, which is the same reason why I liked it, was they felt there was too much description and too much building on side characters. That I really disagree with. I really enjoyed all the descriptive writing and all the building of the side characters. Other people also enjoy it, and maybe this will become me, because I find that in the genre of thrillers, the more you read, the more you can get hints of what's going to happen. So a lot of people who maybe are prolific horror readers thought that it was very predictable in the foreshadowing. So I guess I can see that, but for me as a newbie horror reader, I didn't find that in my experience. 5-star reviews on this book on Goodreads is people thought this book was prime Stephen King. He's obviously been writing for decades. I'm sure people have seen his ups and downs in his writing career, and I think this is his prime. People thought the writing was great. It has a perfect blend of character building, suspense, supernatural, gore, horror, and shocks, and I felt the book was like a roller coaster of emotions. People also loved that he was able to start with a set of happy group of people, aka Lewis's family, and then as the book progresses, you see the decline towards madness and despair. Why I think you should read this book? I mean, I haven't read a lot of Stephen King, but I think if you like Stephen King books, this is a must-read, as lots of people tell me on the internet. I think you should also read it if you love book-to-movie adaptations, because there's a movie on this book, and also if you love good descriptive writing, this one's for you too. Now, I'll share how this book made me feel, because when people recommend me books, I always love to ask them how it made them feel. Because if you ask me a week, a year, 5 years from now, I probably won't remember exactly what the book was about, but I also remember how it made me feel. So this book, The Pet Sematary, it made me feel very spooked out. It also made me very glad that at this moment in my life, I didn't have a pet, because the family in the book, Lewis's family's cat, is probably one of the more creepy characters in the book. So I'm glad at the moment right now I do not have a pet, specifically a cat. Because I do have fishes, but I mean fishes aren't that creepy. Thank you for watching to the end of my review for Stephen King's Pet Sematary. Again, if you've read it, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. And if you want to join me next time, I'm doing a total 180. It's a contemporary romance, and on the top it says the warmest, coziest, sweetest book of the year. So it's called Second First Impressions by Sally Thorne, and I had this book lined up because I thought, just in case Pet Sematary was traumatic for me, I want a nice, cozy book to read. Thank you for watching until the end of my video. I hope you subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!